Tonight, we travel slowly and without hurry to a lonely rock just off the American coast. It is the year 1872. There are no engines humming in the distance, no airplanes passing overhead, no electric lights glowing on the horizon. There is only the ocean and the wind, and a narrow tower of stone rising from a jagged stretch of rock that barely seems meant for human life. The lighthouse stands alone against the Atlantic, its white paint dulled by salt and time. The waves strike the rocks below with a steady, patient rhythm, not angry, not calm, just constant. Inside that tower lives a man few people remember. His name is Elias Turner. Most people never knew it. They simply called him the Keeper. Elias did not begin his life intending to live alone. No child dreams of growing up to speak mostly to gulls and fog. He was born inland, far from the ocean, in a small farming town where the fields stretched wide and flat beneath a forgiving sky. His father believed in soil and seasons. His mother believed in quiet patience. But Elias was different. He would stand at the edge of the fields at dusk and look toward the unseen distance, as if something out there was calling him softly. When he was 22, he left home. He did not argue. He did not announce grand ambitions. He simply packed a small bag and followed the railway east. The ocean, when he first saw it, did not roar. It breathed, slowly, deeply. He took work as a dock laborer at first, hauling rope, loading crates, scrubbing decks. The work was heavy, but the sea fascinated him. Ships arrived and departed like wandering cities. Sailors spoke of storms and distant coasts. But Elias preferred the quiet moments. The early morning fog rolling across the harbor, muting the world into softness. It was during one such morning that he noticed the Lighthouse tender boat arriving at the pier. The men unloading supplies moved without rush. They handled barrels of oil, crates of dried food, bundles of mail. "Where's that going?" asked Elias. "To the outer rock. Supply run for the Keeper." "How long's he out there?" 3 months at a stretch, sometimes longer, weather depending. Elias thought about that. 3 months. Alone. He surprised himself by saying, "You hiring?" They were. And so began his apprenticeship under the aging lighthouse keeper who had already spent 20 years on that rock. The first night Elias stayed in the lighthouse, he did not sleep much. The tower creaked in the wind, the glass panes of the lantern room rattled gently. The sea moved below like a breathing creature in the dark. His mentor, a gray-bearded man named Mr. Halverson, spoke very little. "Routine," Halverson said. "That's what keeps you steady." The job was not dramatic. It was repetitive. Morning. Trim the wick. Clean the lens. Polish the brass. Check the oil levels. Afternoon. Inspect the masonry. Record the weather. Watch the horizon. Evening. Light the lamp before dusk. Ensure the beam turns steady. Wind the clockwork mechanism. Then, sit and listen. Elias learned that loneliness does not arrive suddenly. It seeps in like fog. At first, he enjoyed the simplicity. No crowds, no arguments, no expectations beyond the light itself. Ships depended on that beam. That knowledge felt meaningful. But there were nights when storms surrounded the tower so completely that the world beyond the glass vanished. The wind howled down the chimney like a living voice. Waves exploded against the rock with such force that the entire structure trembled. On those nights, Elias understood the true nature of the job. It was not about adventure. It was about endurance. When Halverson retired 3 years later, Elias took the position officially. He signed his name in careful ink in the government ledger. Keeper of Outer Breaker Light. Salary modest. Supplies quarterly. Relief uncertain during winter months. He did not hesitate. The supply boat left him there alone on the first time a gray October afternoon. The sky was low. The gulls were quiet. As the boat grew smaller against the horizon, Elias felt something shift inside his chest. Not fear, not regret, just a widening space. The tower felt larger without another voice inside it. He walked each level slowly that evening, touching the stone walls as if confirming they were real. At dusk, he climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room. The sun was setting behind a veil of thin clouds, turning the ocean silver. He trimmed the wick carefully, lit a flame, watched as the great Fresnel lens gathered the light and bent it into a powerful beam that stretched outward into the dimming world. There, a single line of brightness sweeping the dark. Back and forth. Back and forth. Ships miles away would see that light and adjust their course. Captains would nod in quiet relief. None of them would think about the man turning the gears. That anonymity suited Elias. He kept detailed logs, wind speed, barometric pressure, wave height estimates. He noted passing vessels when visible. He wrote letters to his sister inland, though the mailboat only carried them every few months. Winter arrived early that year. The supply run scheduled in January was delayed by ice, then delayed again by storms. Weeks passed. The oil stores remained sufficient, he had calculated carefully, but fresh food dwindled. Hardtack, dried beans, salted fish. He rationed without panic. The sea in winter was not violent every day. Sometimes it lay strangely still beneath a pale sky, as if conserving strength. On those calm mornings, Elias would stand outside on the narrow walkway circling the tower and simply watch the horizon blur into whiteness. No land in sight. No boats. Only endless water. He realized during those quiet hours that the world had continued without him entirely. Inland towns bustled, railways expanded, children were born, newspapers printed stories. And here he was, turning a lamp. But something about that small responsibility felt pure. He was not forgotten by the sea. Each night, it tested the rock. Each night, he answered with light. And so the days moved gently forward, measured not in conversation, but in rotations of the beam, and in the steady breathing of the ocean below. The rhythm of the light. The winter did not break all at once. It loosened slowly. The ice that had crusted along the edges of the rock began to thin, then drip, then vanish entirely beneath the returning rhythm of the tide. Elias noticed these changes the way one notices the slow ticking of a clock, not in dramatic shifts, but in patient increments. Morning light came a little earlier. The wind carried less sharpness. The seabirds returned first. They circled the tower cautiously at dawn, their wings cutting quiet shapes through pale air. Elias watched them from the lantern room as he extinguished the lamp after another long night. The flame, when blown out, always left a faint ribbon of smoke that curled upward and disappeared into the chill. Each morning followed the same pattern. He descended the spiral staircase, boots striking the iron steps with a steady, familiar sound. He prepared a simple breakfast, often porridge if grain remained, or dried bread softened in hot water. He ate without hurry. There was no one to speak to, no one to interrupt. Silence, he had discovered, was not empty. It had texture. The walls of the lighthouse carried subtle sounds, the faint contraction of cooling stone, the whisper of wind slipping through unseen seams, the distant pulse of waves colliding with rock far below. After eating, he cleaned. The great Fresnel lens demanded care. Its many prisms captured even the faintest light and magnified it into brilliance. A smear of salt or a trace of soot could dull the beam. Elias polished each section carefully with soft cloth. He had come to admire the lens not just as equipment, but as craftsmanship. Glass shaped into geometry so precise that it could guide ships through darkness. He sometimes thought of the lens as a silent companion. It required his attention, and it responded with light. By late morning, he stepped outside onto the narrow walkway encircling the tower. From there, the ocean stretched endlessly in every direction. On especially clear days, the faintest smudge of mainland shoreline could be glimpsed to the west. But most days, the horizon was a perfect, uninterrupted circle. He had begun keeping track of time not by calendar dates, but by patterns. The way the light shifted across the sea at different hours, the behavior of the birds, the frequency of distant sails appearing in the afternoon. Ships passed more frequently as winter loosened its grip. Some were merchant vessels heavy with cargo, others were fishing schooners hugging the coast. Elias always felt a subtle tightening in his chest when he spotted a sail. Not excitement exactly, more like awareness, proof that the world continued. Sometimes, if the air was still enough, he imagined he could hear faint echoes, voices carried across miles of water. He knew this was unlikely. Sound rarely traveled that far. Still, the mind finds companionship where it can. He kept writing in the logbook. The entries were precise. March 3rd, wind moderate, visibility fair. 2 vessels sighted eastbound. March 5th, fog heavy until noon, bell rung at intervals. The bell stood mounted near the base of the tower. On dense days when visibility vanished entirely, Elias would descend and ring it steadily. The sound was deep and resonant, a hollow metallic note that drifted outward like a warning. It was physical work. The rope pulled against his palms, the bell swinging with measured force. Dung. Pause. Dung. Pause. Hours could pass this way. Fog had a way of shrinking the world. When it settled thickly, the horizon dissolved. The sea and sky merged into one endless gray curtain. The lighthouse seemed suspended in nothingness. Those were the strangest days. Without sight of distance, Elias felt as if the rock floated in isolation from the rest of existence. He would move through his duties carefully during fog, checking the lamp twice, listening for distant horns from ships navigating blindly. On one such day in late March, he heard a horn much closer than usual. It was not the long, steady blast of routine navigation. It was short, urgent. Elias froze on the walkway. Another blast came, closer still. He could not see the vessel. The fog was too dense. He hurried inside, climbed to the lantern room, and verified that the mechanism was turning properly. It was. He descended again and rang the fog bell more vigorously. Dung, dung, dung. The entry answered, closer. Then, faintly through the gray, a dark shape emerged, a schooner drifting dangerously near the reef that surrounded the rock. Elias felt his pulse quicken. This was the reason the light existed. He rang the bell continuously, ignoring the strain in his arms. The schooner adjusted. Its sails shifted angle. Slowly, gradually, it corrected course and slid away into safer waters. The horn sounded once more, longer now. Acknowledgement. Then it faded into the mist. Elias stood still after the sound disappeared. His hands trembled slightly from effort. No one would record the moment in newspapers. No medal would be awarded. But somewhere on that ship, sailors would return home safely, because the light had turned, because the bell had rung. He allowed himself a single slow breath of satisfaction. Then he returned to routine. The isolation did not weigh heavily on him in those early months of spring. Instead, it settled like a cloak, familiar, predictable. He repaired small cracks in the stonework where winter frost had crept in. He reorganized supply shelves. He read the few books he kept, mostly practical manuals and a worn volume of poetry his mother once owned. He did not rush through the poems. He read them aloud sometimes, softly, simply to hear a human voice in the tower. The sound echoed strangely against the curved walls. At dusk each evening he climbed the spiral stairs again. Lighting the lamp never grew ordinary. Even after months, there was something solemn about striking the match. The wick caught flame. The lens gathered brightness. The mechanism began its steady rotation, and the beams swept outward into darkness. Back and forth, back and forth. Elias would sit on a small wooden stool in the lantern room during the first hour after lighting, simply watching the beam move across the water. It created a rhythm in his thoughts. He no longer counted days since the last supply boat. He counted revolutions of light. Sometimes he imagined that somewhere beyond the visible horizon, another lighthouse keeper performed the same motion, another solitary figure tending flame against the night, connected not by conversation, but by purpose. As April approached, the air softened further. The first supply boat of the year would come soon. He knew this by schedule, but he also felt it in the air, the subtle sense of change. He wondered how it would feel to hear another voice inside the tower again. Would conversation seem loud? Would the presence of another person feel intrusive? He did not know. He only knew that when the boat arrived, it would eventually depart again, and the rhythm of the light would continue, because the ocean did not pause, and neither could he. The beam turned steadily through another evening, across dark water, across distance, across silence. And Elias Turner remained at his post, keeper of a light few saw up close, but many depended upon. Unseen, uncelebrated, essential. The supply boat. The first clear morning of April arrived without ceremony. There was no trumpet of sunlight, no dramatic change in the sky, only a subtle brightness along the eastern horizon, pale and steady. Elias had already extinguished the lamp and cleaned the lens when he noticed something different in the air. The wind had shifted. It carried the faintest scent of coal smoke. He stood very still on the walkway outside the lantern room and listened. At first, there was only the soft lap of tide against stone. Then, far off, almost imagined, the distant chug of an engine. Not a sailing vessel, a steam tender. The supply boat. He did not wave. There was no need. The captain knew the rock well. Elias simply watched as the small black shape grew larger against the water, cutting a deliberate path through gentle swells. The boat circled carefully before approaching the narrow landing point carved into the rock's lower edge. Timing was important. Even calm seas could push a vessel hard against stone. Two crewmen leapt ashore with ropes, securing the boat quickly. Crates followed. Barrels of oil, sacks of flour, bundles of letters tied with twine, and finally, a man Elias had never seen before. He was younger than Elias by perhaps 10 years, with a trimmed beard and a restless expression. "Keeper Turner," the man called up toward the tower. "Yes," Elias answered calmly as he descended. They shook hands briefly, firm, practical. "Name's Daniel Brooks, assistant keeper, assigned for the season." The words echoed faintly in the stone entryway. Assistant keeper. Elias had known one might be assigned. Traffic along the coast had increased in recent years. Regulations required relief and assistance during busier months. Still, hearing it aloud felt strange. The tower had belonged to silence. Now it would contain another presence. Daniel looked around with open curiosity. "So this is it," he said, glancing upward along the spiral staircase. "Smaller than I imagined." "It grows larger in winter," Elias replied evenly. Daniel laughed, unsure if it was a joke. The unloading continued for nearly an hour. The supply captain reviewed inventory lists with Elias at a small wooden table near the base of the tower. Oil reserves sufficient, fresh water barrels sealed, salted meat, beans, rice, flour. Mail confirmed delivered. Relief boats scheduled for late September, weather permitting. Weather permitting. The phrase lingered in the air. With final nods and brief farewells, the crew returned to the tender. The ropes were cast off. The boat pulled away, shrinking steadily into distance. Elias and Daniel stood on the rock watching until it became a smudge against the horizon. Then silence returned. But it was no longer the same silence. Daniel broke it first. "So," he said, brushing salt from his coat, "what's the routine?" Elias considered the question. "Routine keeps the light steady. You'll learn it." The day unfolded differently with two men inside the tower. Footsteps overlapped, voices carried. Daniel spoke often about his previous post along a quieter stretch of coastline, about his wife expecting their first child in autumn, about the boredom he feared more than storms. Elias listened more than he spoke. He demonstrated the polishing of the lens, explaining the care required for each prism. Daniel handled the cloth carefully at first, almost reverently. "It's beautiful," Daniel murmured, examining the glass. "Yes," Elias agreed. They divided tasks, morning cleaning shared, logbooks alternating days, fog bell duty rotating in shifts. At dusk, Elias insisted on lighting the lamp himself for the first week, allowing Daniel to observe. The ritual remained solemn. Match struck, wick catching flame, lens capturing brilliance. Daniel watched quietly as the beam began its steady arc across water. "It's strange," Daniel said softly. You light it, and then it's just there, doing its work. Yes, Elias replied. It does not need applause. The presence of another man altered the rhythm subtly. Meals became conversations rather than silent nourishment. Daniel asked questions about the harshest storms Elias had witnessed. Elias described one winter gale when waves struck so high they coated the lantern windows in freezing spray. "Were you afraid?" Daniel asked. "Yes," Elias answered without hesitation. "But fear passes. The light must not." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. As weeks passed, Elias discovered that companionship was both comforting and unsettling. He had grown used to speaking only when necessary. Now the tower echoed with stories, Daniel recalling childhood fishing trips, describing the small house he hoped to buy inland. At night, after the lamp was lit and mechanisms checked, the two men sometimes sat at the small wooden table below and shared tea brewed from dwindling leaves. Daniel filled silence easily. Elias allowed it. Yet there were moments when Elias found himself climbing alone to the lantern room earlier than necessary, simply to sit beside the rotating beam. Not to escape Daniel, but to remember the stillness that had once filled the tower completely. In late May, traffic along the coast increased noticeably. Fishing vessels moved northward, merchant ships traveled heavier routes. The lights swept across more sails now, reflecting briefly in distant glass and metal. Daniel grew adept at identifying ship types by silhouette. "That one's Baltimore-built," he would say confidently. Elias admired the young man's enthusiasm. One evening, as dusk settled softly and the ocean glowed copper beneath fading sun, Daniel stood on the walkway and looked outward. "Does it ever feel small?" he asked. "What?" "This, the job, compared to the world." Elias considered carefully before answering. "The world is large, but ships sink in small places." Daniel did not respond immediately. He seemed to weigh the words as the first stars appeared faintly overhead. Summer approached gently. The sea calmed more often than it raged. Days grew longer. With two men tending the station, the work felt lighter. Yet Elias noticed something subtle within himself. The loneliness that had once settled like fog no longer pressed against him. Instead, he sensed its absence, and he realized that even solitude can become a companion. Daniel's presence brought laughter, but it also reminded Elias that the world beyond the rock continued in ways he no longer fully belonged to. There were conversations about families, towns, futures. Elias rarely spoke of his own. His sister's letters had grown infrequent. Years had slipped by quietly. On a warm June evening, after extinguishing the lamp at dawn, Elias stood outside alone while Daniel slept below. The sea was glassy, almost reflective. He could see the tower mirrored faintly in the water. For a moment, the rock did not feel isolated. It felt suspended in time. And Elias wondered briefly how many seasons he would continue turning the light, not because he wished to leave, but because he no longer knew where else he might belong. The beam would sweep again at dusk. Daniel would assist. Ships would pass. Summer would deepen, and the lighthouse would continue its patient watch over a restless sea. Summer without edges. Summer arrived not with heat, but with softness. The wind lost its sharpness. The sea turned a deeper blue. The horizon stretched clean and uninterrupted beneath wide skies. With Daniel now settled into routine, the lighthouse felt less like a solitary tower and more like a small, self-contained world. The days developed a rhythm that almost resembled comfort. They woke just after sunrise. They extinguished the lamp. They cleaned the lens in silence that was no longer heavy. Daniel had stopped speaking constantly. The rock had begun shaping him as it had shaped Elias, smoothing his words, stretching his pauses. The work divided naturally now. Daniel preferred outdoor inspections, checking mortar lines, clearing nesting debris from corners of stone, oiling hinges along the lower doors. Elias remained drawn to the lantern room. He trusted the younger man, but the lens still felt like his responsibility, his quiet companion. On clear afternoons, ships passed frequently enough to create a sense of distant company. White sails drifted slowly across the horizon like thoughts that refused to fully form. Occasionally, a vessel would dip its flag briefly in acknowledgement of the lighthouse. Daniel would grin at such gestures. "They see us," he would say. Elias would not. But he understood something Daniel did not yet fully grasp. They saw the light, not the men. Late one July evening, the sea flattened so completely that it appeared almost painted. The sky glowed amber, then pink, then lavender. Daniel leaned against the railing and watched the colors change. "It feels endless," he said quietly. "It is," Elias replied. Daniel was silent for a long time. Then he asked, "Do you ever think about leaving?" The question hung in the warm air. Elias did not answer immediately. Below them, the tide shifted gently against stone. "I thought about it once, years ago," he said at last. "What stopped you?" Elias watched a distant fishing boat crawl across the far edge of sight. "The light." Daniel smiled faintly, but Elias did not. It was not poetry, it was fact. Each night when the lamp ignited and the beams stretched outward, Elias felt tethered to something larger than himself. A responsibility simple enough to understand. Turn the light, keep it steady, endure. Summer storms were different from winter storms. They arrived quickly and departed just as fast. Dark clouds would gather in afternoon silence, thick and sudden. Rain would fall in hard sheets, blurring sea and sky. Lightning sometimes struck the water close enough to send white reflections flashing against the tower walls. Daniel reacted with visible energy the first time it happened. He rushed upward, checking shutters, inspecting seals. Elias remained calm. "These storms speak loudly," he said, "but they do not linger." He was right. Within hours, the sky would clear, leaving the ocean washed and shimmering beneath returning sun. August brought heat that settled heavily against stone. The interior of the lighthouse grew warm, even with windows open. They worked slowly during midday. Daniel sometimes read aloud from newspapers brought in the last supply run. Stories of expanding railroads, new industrial towns rising inland, inventions promising to reshape the nation. Elias listened with detached interest. The world described in ink felt distant, almost imagined. On the rock, time moved differently. It was measured not by progress, but by persistence. One afternoon, a pleasure yacht, rare in those waters, passed closer than most ships. Its deck was crowded with well-dressed passengers, their laughter faintly audible across calm sea. Daniel waved impulsively. A few on the yacht waved back. Bright clothing flashed in sunlight. Music drifted faintly, carried by wind. For several long minutes, color and motion filled the horizon. Then the yacht continued southward and vanished. Silence returned. Daniel's smile faded slightly. "They live so differently," he murmured. "Yes," Elias agreed. "Does it ever feel like we're outside of it?" Elias considered carefully. "We are outside of much, but not outside of purpose." Daniel seemed to accept that answer, though it did not fully satisfy him. As summer stretched on, Elias noticed something subtle within himself. The ache of deep loneliness that had defined earlier winters had softened over the years. But now, with companionship present, a different awareness surfaced. He realized he had grown accustomed to absence. Solitude had shaped his thoughts into steady, narrow channels. Conversation widened them again, sometimes comfortably, sometimes not. There were evenings when Daniel would speak of his unborn child, wondering out loud about holding the infant, about teaching him to fish, about building a home. Elias would listen quietly. He had once imagined such futures too, long ago. But time on the rock had eroded those possibilities gently, like waves smoothing stone. Not painfully, simply persistently. One night in late August, after lighting the lamp, Elias remained in the lantern room long after Daniel had gone below. The beam swept across calm black water. Stars scattered above like cold sparks. He rested his hand lightly on the brass housing of the mechanism, feeling the faint vibration of turning gears. Back and forth. Back and forth. The motion was steady enough to quiet thought. He imagined the countless nights the lamp had turned before him, and the countless nights it would turn after he was gone. Keepers replaced, names forgotten, but the beam continuing. There was comfort in that, and also something humbling. Below, Daniel's footsteps moved across the lower floor. A chair scraped softly. The small human sounds echoed upward. Daniel realized that summer was nearing its end. The relief boat would arrive in a matter of weeks. Daniel would leave before winter. The tower would grow quiet again. He tried to imagine the return of complete silence. It no longer felt entirely familiar. Yet he knew he would adapt. The rock shaped those who stayed upon it, slowly, without drama, without edges. The sea exhaled against stone. The lamp burned steady. And above dark water, the light continued its patient sweep into the endless night. The departure. September arrived with a cooler wind. Not cold yet, not harsh, just different. The air carried the faint metallic scent that always came before autumn along the coast. Daniel noticed it first. "It smells like home," he said one morning as they stood on the outer walkway. Elias understood what he meant. There was something in the air that suggested fields beyond the sea, trees turning somewhere inland, chimneys soon to be lit. For the first time since spring, the thought of the relief boat no longer felt distant, it felt near. The days shortened gradually. The sunset crept earlier across the water, fading from gold to amber more quickly than before. The sea, too, seemed to sense the shift. Its surface no longer lay perfectly still in the evenings. A restlessness returned, subtle but steady. Daniel spoke more frequently of leaving now. He counted days in quiet calculations. "If the boat comes on schedule," he said one afternoon while repairing a hinge near the lower door, "I'll be home before the first frost." Elias nodded. "You look forward to it," he observed. "Yes," Daniel admitted. "I didn't think I would miss noise so much, but I do." Elias considered that. Noise. He had not thought of noise as something to miss in many years. To him, silence had become textured and full, not empty. But Daniel had lived differently. They both knew that once the relief boat arrived, Daniel would depart and Elias would remain. The lighthouse did not change for seasons of life. It only continued. On the final week before the scheduled pickup, a storm gathered unexpectedly from the northeast. It was not violent, but it lingered longer than expected. Rain fell in persistent sheets. The wind circled the tower in low, constant pressure. Visibility shrank for nearly 2 full days. They rang the fog bell in shifts again, the deep metallic tone carrying across gray distance. Daniel's hands blistered slightly from rope friction. He laughed about it. "Better than dock work," he said. Elias smiled faintly. The storm delayed several passing vessels, and for a time the horizon held nothing but shifting fog. During those days, conversation slowed between them, not from tension, but from awareness. The end of the season approached. When the storm finally cleared, the sea seemed washed clean. Bright sunlight spilled across the rock. Daniel climbed to the lantern room just before dusk and stood beside Elias as the lamp was prepared. "I'm glad I came," Daniel said quietly. Elias did not look at him immediately. Yes, you learned the rhythm." Daniel nodded. "I understand it now, the work. It's not exciting, it's not heroic, but it matters." "Yes," Elias repeated. They lit the lamp together that evening. Daniel struck the match. Elias adjusted the wick. The flame rose steady and strong. The lens gathered the light, bending it outward in its familiar arc. Back and forth, back and forth. 3 mornings later, the sound of an approaching engine returned across calm water. The relief boat. This time, Elias felt no surprise, only recognition. The tender approached with practiced caution, ropes secured, crates lowered, fresh oil delivered, mail exchanged. Daniel's small trunk was carried down carefully. He shook Elias's hand longer this time. "I won't forget this place," Daniel said. "You may, but that is not wrong." Daniel smiled, unsure whether it was comfort or truth. Before stepping aboard, he turned once more toward the tower. The white stone stood steady against bright sky. The lantern room glass flashed in sunlight. "It's quieter than I expected," Daniel said. "It becomes quieter still," Elias answered. The engine started again. Water churned. The boat pulled away slowly. Daniel lifted a hand in farewell. Elias raised his in return. The distance widened. The boat shrank. The sound faded. And then once again, there was only ocean, only wind, only the narrow tower rising from rock. Elias remained standing on the landing long after the boat disappeared. The silence that followed was not sudden. It settled gently, like dusk. He walked back inside. The interior felt larger already. Footsteps echoed differently without a second pair to soften them. He climbed the spiral staircase slowly. At the lantern room he paused. The lens waited. The mechanism rested, ready for evening. He touched the brass housing lightly, feeling its cool surface beneath his palm. Autumn would deepen, storms would return with greater force. The long winter months would stretch ahead. He had done it before. He would do it again. Below, waves brushed stone in steady repetition. The rhythm had not changed, only the voices within the tower had. As sunset approached, Elias prepared the lamp alone. The match flared softly. The wick caught flame. The lens transformed it into brilliance. The beam stretched outward into darkening sea. Back and forth, back and forth. The lighthouse resumed its solitary watch, and Elias Turner, keeper of outer breaker light, stood once more in full companionship with silence, not abandoned, not forgotten, simply alone again. The ocean breathed, the light turned, and autumn began. The first great storm. October did not announce itself loudly. It arrived in layers. The sky grew lower, the wind sharpened, the sea lost its summer softness. Elias felt the change in his bones before he saw it in the water. There is a certain stillness that sometimes comes before a large storm, not calm, but pause. The birds grow quiet. The horizon blurs slightly. Even the waves seem to draw inward, as if preparing. On the morning the barometer dropped sharply, Elias noted it in the log without drama. October 11th, pressure falling steadily, wind shifting northeast. He had seen the pattern before. The day remained strangely bright, though the air felt heavy. By afternoon, thin clouds stretched across the sky like pulled wool. Elias secured the lower doors and inspected every latch twice. He checked oil reserves carefully. Storm nights consumed more fuel. The lamp must burn stronger, steady, unwavering. By dusk, the wind began to rise. Not violently at first, just insistently. It circled the tower, probing its edges. The first rain arrived sideways. Sharp droplets struck the lantern glass in slanting lines. Elias lit the lamp early. The flame caught smoothly. The lens turned. The beam swept outward into thickening haze. Back and forth, back and forth. Darkness gathered quickly that evening. The horizon vanished before full nightfall. The storm did not explode. It built. Wind layered upon wind. Rain thickened into sheets. Waves struck the rock with increasing force, each impact sending a tremor upward through stone. Elias remained in the lantern room longer than usual, listening to the pitch of the wind change. There are different voices in a storm. Some howl high and sharp along the glass. Others push low and heavy against the foundation. This one carried both. Around midnight, a wave struck with unusual strength. The tower shuddered deeply. The lantern glass rattled in its metal frame. Elias placed one steady hand against the central column of the lens apparatus, feeling the vibration. The mechanism continued turning. That was what mattered. He descended briefly to inspect the lower level. Water had begun seeping across the outer landing, white spray bursting upward in bursts like shattered glass. He secured the inner door again and climbed back to the top. Sleep would not come that night. Storms required presence. By 2 in the morning, the sea had transformed completely. It was no longer a surface, it was motion itself. Waves rose higher than the lower balcony, smashing against stone in explosive force. The sound was constant now, not separate impacts, but a continuous roar. Elias adjusted the wick slightly to ensure maximum brightness. The beam cut through rain in steady arcs. He imagined ships miles away, captains gripping wheels tightly, eyes straining through darkness. They might not see the rock, they might not see the tower, but they would see the light. That was enough. At some point in the early hours, lightning tore across the sky in jagged brilliance. For a brief instant, the entire ocean was visible, towering waves frozen in white illumination. Then darkness returned just as quickly. Thunder followed, deep and rolling. The tower shook again. Elias remained calm. Fear visited him briefly, as it always did during the fiercest moments. A tightening in the chest, a quiet awareness of fragility. But fear did not stay long. Routine displaced it. Check the flame, monitor the gears, listen to the glass. Toward dawn, the storm reached its highest fury. The wind screamed now, a sound so steady it felt almost mechanical. Rain struck horizontally. The beam of light struggled against the thickness of water in the air, but it continued its sweep, back and forth, back and forth. Then, as storms often do, it began to ease. Not all at once, gradually. The wind lowered its pitch. The rain softened. The waves remained high, but their rhythm grew less chaotic. By mid-morning, pale light filtered through thinning cloud. Elias extinguished the lamp with careful precision. Smoke curled upward, faint against gray sky. He stood at the lantern window and looked outward. The sea remained restless, but the worst had passed. The rock was soaked. White salt streaked every surface. Debris clung to lower stone. Seaweed, broken wood fragments, foam. He descended slowly to inspect the damage. The lower walkway had taken the brunt of the assault. Several bolts loosened. One railing bent slightly inward. Nothing catastrophic. The tower had endured. It always did. Elias worked methodically through the afternoon, clearing debris and reinforcing fixtures. The air smelled sharply of salt and wet stone. His hands grew raw from cold water and rope, but there was a quiet satisfaction in repair. The storm had tested the light. The light had answered. By evening, the sky cleared almost completely. A wide band of orange stretched low across the horizon. The ocean, though still unsettled, reflected the fading glow. Elias climbed once more to the lantern room. He prepared the lamp, struck the match, lit the wick. The flame rose strong and steady, as if the storm had never touched it. The lens captured it beautifully. The beams swept outward across calmer water, back and forth, back and forth. The first great storm of the season had passed. Winter would bring harsher trials still, but for now the lighthouse stood. Elias stood with it, alone again, but not uncertain. The sea could rage, the wind could scream, the stone could tremble. Yet as long as the flame burned and the lens turned, the purpose remained unchanged. And that purpose was enough. The long gray season. After the first great storm, the world seemed to narrow. October faded quietly into November, and color drained from the sea. The bright blues of summer disappeared. The sky turned pale and metallic. The horizon often dissolved into a single unbroken line of gray. Elias no longer waited for the supply boat. There would be none until spring. Winter on the rock was not an event, it was a condition. The days shortened steadily. Sunrise arrived late and dim. Sunset crept in early, sometimes before he had fully completed afternoon repairs. He adjusted his routine carefully. More oil inspections, more wick trimming, more frequent checks on glass seals. Cold changes everything. Metal tightens, stone contracts, flame behaves differently. One morning in early November, Elias woke before dawn to an unfamiliar stillness. No wind, no waves striking hard, only a muted hush. He climbed the spiral stairs and looked outward. Fog, thick and absolute. It pressed against the lantern glass like wool packed tight. The world had vanished. There was no horizon, no sky, no sea, only whiteness. On such days, time felt suspended. He rang the fog bell at measured intervals. Dong, pause, dong, pause. The sound seemed swallowed quickly, absorbed into dense air. He imagined ships somewhere beyond the unseen distance, navigating slowly, listening for that hollow tone. Hours passed in repetition. The fog did not lift until late afternoon. When it did, it revealed a sea darker than before. November deepened. Cold rain replaced soft summer showers. The rock grew slick and treacherous. Elias moved carefully along the outer walkway, boots placed with deliberate precision. Isolation settled differently now. It no longer felt like quiet companionship. It felt heavier. He noticed it most during meals. The small wooden table below the stairs seemed larger than it had with Daniel seated across from him. He ate slowly. The sound of spoon against bowl echoed faintly. There were moments when he would begin to speak aloud, a half-formed comment, a passing thought, before remembering no one was there to hear it. He did not feel sadness exactly, only awareness. The human mind grows used to voices. Without them, thoughts expand inward. He began reading aloud again in the evenings after lighting the lamp. The old book of poetry his mother had once owned lay worn but intact. His voice sounded different now, deeper, perhaps slower. The curved stone walls returned his words gently. Sometimes he paused mid-sentence simply to listen to the echo fade. Outside, the sea resumed its winter temperament, not always violent, but never entirely calm. Long rolling swells replaced summer's glassy surface. The sky often remained overcast for days at a time. On rare clear nights, stars appeared sharp and piercing against black sky. Those were Elias's favorite hours. He would sit in the lantern room with the lamp turning steadily and gaze upward between revolutions of light. The universe seemed impossibly wide. The lantern beam felt small by comparison, yet small lights matter most in darkness. Mid-November brought another storm, less fierce than the first, but longer. It lasted 3 days. Wind steady, rain constant, waves unrelenting. Elias slept lightly between checks. He moved through the tower with practiced familiarity, even in darkness. Hand along wall, foot on stair, mind steady. During the height of the second night, a loud crack sounded below. Not thunder, stone. He descended immediately with lantern in hand. A section of outer masonry near the base had loosened under repeated wave impact, not collapsed, but shifted. Water surged dangerously close to the threshold. Elias worked through freezing spray, reinforcing the inner barrier with spare timber bracing. The labor was exhausting. His fingers numbed quickly in cold water, but the door held. The storm eventually weakened. Morning light revealed damage, but nothing fatal. The lighthouse endured again. Elias made careful repairs over the following days. Winter tested slowly. It did not destroy in one strike. It wore down edges. Late November brought the first frost. Ice formed along the railing overnight. The wind grew sharper. Even indoors, breath sometimes fogged faintly in the early morning before the small iron stove warmed the lower room. Fuel had to be managed carefully. Wood limited, coal modest. The lamp always came first. Warmth for the keeper was secondary. By early December, daylight had shrunk to a brief window. Gray morning, short pale afternoon, early dusk. The lamp burned longer now. Nights stretched wide. It was during these long nights that Elias felt the full weight of solitude. There were no passing ships some evenings, no distant sails, no flicker of other lights along the coast. Only the beam turning, back and forth, back and forth. Winter had settled fully now. The long gray season had claimed the rock, and Elias Turner remained at his post, alone, but steady. The night without horizon. The days following the longest night did not grow brighter all at once. Winter does not retreat quickly. It lingers. It tests patience. Late December settled over the rock with a quiet heaviness. The sea turned darker, almost iron gray beneath low sky. Wind carved steady lines across the water, and the air carried a deep, biting cold that reached through wool and into bone. Elias adjusted to it without complaint. He rose in darkness. He moved through darkness. He lit the lamp into darkness. There were stretches now when no vessel appeared for days. The shipping routes shifted slightly south in harsher weather. Fishermen remained in harbor. Even merchant traffic grew cautious. The horizon often held nothing but shifting weather. One afternoon, a bank of fog began forming earlier than usual. It rolled inward from the east, thick and deliberate. By dusk, it had swallowed the sea entirely. There are fogs that drift, and there are fogs that settle like walls. This one settled, dense, absolute. The world beyond the lantern glass vanished completely. There was no distinction between water and sky, only blankness pressing against the tower. Elias prepared for a long night. He filled the oil reservoir carefully, checking each valve twice. He trimmed the wick slightly narrower than usual to prevent uneven burn in damp air. When he struck the match, the flame flared briefly before stabilizing. The lens caught it immediately, bending the light into its steady arc. But in the fog, the beam did not stretch far. It became a glowing tunnel only a short distance from the tower before dissolving into gray. The light no longer reached a visible horizon. It simply vanished. Elias stood watching this for a long moment. Back and forth, back and forth, light entering nothingness. He descended and began ringing the fog bell. Dong, pause. Dong, pause. The sound felt strangely muted tonight. It seemed absorbed quickly, as though the fog itself had weight. Hours passed in that rhythm. At intervals, he returned to the lantern room to inspect the mechanism. Everything remained steady, flame constant, gears turning. Outside, the fog thickened further. By midnight, even the faint outline of the balcony railing had disappeared from view. The tower felt suspended in blank space. There are moments in isolation when the mind begins to stretch beyond its usual boundaries. Without visible distance, without reference points, thought grows wide. Elias sat quietly in the lantern room, listening to the subtle scrape of rotating gears. He imagined ships somewhere beyond sight. He imagined captains staring into gray, straining to catch the brief flash of his light before it faded. He imagined sailors counting seconds between rotations, calculating position by memory and discipline. The thought comforted him. Even unseen, the light mattered. Toward 2 in the morning, a faint sound reached him. Not wind, not wave. A horn. Short, uncertain. He stood immediately. The horn sounded again, closer this time. The fog had swallowed direction. It was impossible to know precisely where the vessel lay. Elias moved quickly. He checked the lamp's brightness. Strong. He descended and rang the fog bell more forcefully. Dong, dong. Dong. The horn answered, longer now, urgent. Somewhere in that white void, a ship navigated blindly. Elias climbed back to the lantern room and opened the small side vent briefly to listen more clearly, despite the cold air rushing in. Another horn blast, very near. He leaned forward against the glass, straining to see through density that refused to yield. Nothing. Only shifting whiteness illuminated faintly by his own beam. He felt no panic, only focus. He adjusted the wick slightly higher, increasing brightness. The flame responded obediently. The lens projected a stronger arc, though still swallowed quickly by fog. Below, the sea surged unseen. Then suddenly, through the gray, a shadow, large, moving slowly. A dark hull emerged faintly, far too close to the reef line that guarded the rock. Elias felt a sharp tightening in his chest. The vessel drifted dangerously. The horn sounded again, almost directly beneath the tower. He rang the fog bell continuously now, ignoring the strain in his arms. Dong, dong, dong. The hull loomed clearer for a moment, then faded again into thickness. He listened. The deep groan of timbers shifting, the slap of water against wood. Then, a change. The shadow angled slightly. The horn sounded once, longer and steadier. The vessel was turning, slowly, carefully. Elias continued ringing until the sound of waves against hull grew fainter. Another minute passed, then another. The horn sounded one final time, distant now. Acknowledgement. Relief. Relief moved through Elias, not as excitement, but as release. He stopped ringing the bell. The fog remained thick, unbroken, but the danger had passed. He climbed back to the lantern room and sat heavily on the small wooden stool. His hands trembled slightly from effort and cold. The beam continued its steady arc into white emptiness. Back and forth, back and forth. For a long time, he simply watched it. The ship would never know his name. Its captain might record in a log that the lighthouse had been sighted in heavy fog. No more. But somewhere, sailors would see another dawn. That was enough. The fog did not lift until nearly midday. When it did, the sea appeared strangely calm, as though nothing significant had occurred. The horizon returned slowly, pale sky meeting dark water once more. Elias extinguished the lamp with quiet precision. Smoke curled upward briefly before fading. He stepped outside into cold morning air. The rock glistened with moisture. The world felt restored to shape. But he knew that during the night something essential had been tested again. Not the stone, not the glass, him. And once more the light had answered. Winter would continue. More storms would come. More nights without horizon would settle over the sea. Yet as long as flame met lens and gears continued turning, the purpose endured. The ocean breathed beneath gray sky, and Elias Turner remained its silent guardian. The weight of January. January arrived without announcement. There was no single morning when Elias declared it had begun. The calendar marked the change, but the sea did not care for numbers. Still, something shifted. The cold deepened. The light of day grew thin and pale, as if strained through layers of distant cloud. Even sound behaved differently in January. It carried less warmth. The wind's voice sharpened. The sea struck stone with a harder edge. Elias rose before dawn as he always did. The lamp still burned from the long night. Its flame glowed steady behind thick glass, patient and unwavering. He climbed the spiral stairs slowly, one hand brushing the cold inner wall. The lantern room felt colder than before. He inspected the wick, trimmed it carefully, then extinguished the flame. A thin ribbon of smoke curled upward and vanished into chilled air. January demanded more attention to small details. Oil thickened slightly in low temperatures. Metal contracted. The mechanism that turned the lens required precise winding, neither too tight nor too loose. Each movement mattered more. Mistakes in summer could be corrected easily. Mistakes in winter lingered. Outside, the sea rolled in long, heavy swells, not chaotic like autumn storms, but weighty, deliberate. The sky remained overcast for days at a time. Elias found himself measuring time not by sunrise and sunset, but by the intervals between lighting and extinguishing the lamp. Night felt dominant now. Day felt temporary. On January 8th, snow fell properly for the first time. Large, wind-driven flakes that accumulated along the upper railing and clung to the edges of stone. The rock turned white. For several hours, the world looked almost gentle. Snow softened hard lines. It muffled sound. Even the sea seemed quieter beneath its falling curtain. Elias stood in the lantern room and watched the flakes swirl through the path of the light as dusk approached. When he lit the lamp that evening, the beam sliced through moving snow, creating a tunnel of shimmering white particles. It was strangely beautiful, but beauty in winter is brief. By midnight, wind intensified. Snow shifted from graceful descent to horizontal assault. The beam struggled again, not from weakness, but from thickness in the air. Elias adjusted the wick slightly higher. He checked the clockwork mechanism twice. Outside, ice began forming along the edges of glass.
He climbed down carefully with a scraper and cleared accumulation from the outer frames, working quickly before his fingers numbed. The cold entered his gloves despite layered wool. Breath formed clouds before his face. Inside again, he warmed his hands briefly near the small stove before returning to the lantern room. The night stretched long. There were no horns from distant ships, no silhouettes along the horizon, only snow and wind. By morning, drifts had formed in sheltered corners of the rock. The lower landing required clearing to prevent dangerous buildup. Elias worked steadily with shovel and salt, pushing snow over the edge into waiting sea. The physical labor warmed him. It also grounded him. Winter could not be ignored. It demanded engagement. Mid-January brought a stretch of stillness. No storms, no snow, just a cold, pale sky and a sea that moved with quiet heaviness. It was during this stillness that loneliness pressed most deeply. Storms create urgency. Urgency narrows thought. But calm winter days leave space. Elias found himself lingering over old memories. His mother's voice reading softly near a fireplace. The creak of barnwood in early frost. The scent of soil before spring planting. Those memories did not bring regret, only distance. He wondered briefly whether his sister still lived in the same inland house. Letters had grown infrequent over the years. Travel was difficult. Time moved differently for those rooted in land. He had chosen the sea, and the sea had chosen him in return. One evening, as he prepared the lamp under a sky streaked faintly pink at sunset, he noticed a small dark speck along the northern horizon. At first he assumed it a trick of light, but it remained, slowly growing. A vessel, rare for this season. He watched carefully. Through his small telescope, he identified a modest cargo ship pushing steadily through cold water. The sight stirred something unexpected inside him. Not excitement, not joy, but connection, proof that movement continued beyond the rock. He lit the lamp with particular care that night. The flame rose strong. The beam swept outward confidently, back and forth, back and forth. The vessel passed safely at a respectable distance. Its own lanterns glowed faintly in return, two small lights crossing paths in darkness. Elias stood at the window long after the ship faded from view. January weighed heavily, but it did not defeat. The rock endured, the tower endured, and so did he. Toward the end of the month, wind returned in steady force, not violent, but relentless, the kind that hums continuously through every seam of stone. It created a low, constant sound within the tower, almost like distant chanting. At night, lying on his narrow bed between inspections, Elias listened to that hum. It no longer unsettled him. It reminded him that the world beyond walls remained active. Sea moving, air shifting, stars turning above cloud cover unseen. He rose once more near midnight to check the lamp. Everything steady, everything aligned. The beam continued its patient arc. January would pass, as all months do. February would follow with its own tests. But for now, in the deepest weight of winter, Elias Turner remained at his post, silent, attentive, unmoved by the heaviness of cold. The light turned, and the sea, however dark, accepted it.
The coldest watch. February carried a different kind of cold. January had been heavy and gray. February was sharp. The wind no longer rolled steadily across the sea. It cut. It arrived in sudden gusts that struck the tower at odd angles, rattling shutters and pressing against stone with impatient force. Elias felt it even before he opened his eyes each morning. The air inside the lower room held a deeper chill. The small stove required more coal. The metal railing of the spiral staircase stung his hand if he touched it too long. Still, the routine did not change. He rose, he climbed, he checked the flame. The lamp, faithful and steady, seemed almost immune to the cold once fully lit. But starting it required precision. The oil flowed more slowly now. The wick stiffened if not trimmed carefully. On the first week of February, a bitter windstorm settled in without heavy precipitation. There was no dramatic snowfall, no towering waves, only wind, constant, unforgiving. It screamed across the lantern glass and forced its way through unseen seams, creating low whistles in the stairwell. Sleep became lighter. Not from fear, but from sound. The tower seemed to breathe differently under such pressure. Elias moved through his duties with deliberate calm. He inspected each window pane for stress fractures. He reinforced a loose hinge near the outer balcony. He double-checked the fastenings around the fog bell mount. Cold weakens materials quietly. He would not allow weakness to grow unnoticed. On February 9th, the temperature dropped further still. The sea itself seemed to thicken. Foam froze briefly where waves crashed highest against rock, leaving white-crusted ridges that glittered under pale sun. Elias worked carefully with salt and hammer to break dangerous ice buildup from the lower landing. His gloves stiffened, his breath clouded constantly. The isolation during these coldest days felt different from January's weight. It was not emotional, it was physical. The body felt alone against elements. Each movement required intention. Each task consumed more energy. Yet within that effort, clarity sharpened. There is a certain focus that arrives when survival is simple and immediate. Keep the flame steady, keep the structure sound, keep yourself warm enough to continue. Nothing else intruded. One evening, as dusk fell beneath a hard, colorless sky, Elias paused longer than usual before lighting the lamp. The cold had settled deep into the lantern room. His fingers felt stiff despite gloves. He removed them carefully and rubbed warmth back into his hands before striking the match. The flame caught with a soft hiss. He adjusted the wick with slow precision. The light rose. The lens embraced it. The beam swept outward into a dark that seemed denser than usual. Back and forth, back and forth. That night, the wind reached its peak. Not a roaring storm, but a sustained force that pressed against every surface. The tower vibrated faintly under its strain. Elias remained awake for most of the night, seated on the small stool near the mechanism. He watched the gears turn. He listened for irregular sounds. Twice he descended to inspect the lower door as waves surged higher than expected. The rock held, the door held, the light held.
Near dawn, as the wind finally began to ease, something unusual occurred. The sky cleared, abruptly. Cloud cover tore apart, revealing a sharp expanse of winter stars. When Elias extinguished the lamp at sunrise, the eastern horizon glowed faintly lavender beneath icy blue. The sea, though still cold and restless, reflected a fragile light. He stepped outside onto the balcony. The air was biting but clean. Above him, the sky stretched vast and unbroken. For a moment, he felt suspended between two infinities, the ocean below and the stars above. The rock seemed very small, the tower smaller still, and yet the flame he tended each night carved a visible mark across that vastness. February continued in alternating patterns, days of brittle stillness followed by nights of sharp wind. No major ships passed for nearly a week. The shipping lanes had shifted south again to avoid unpredictable currents and ice. Elias recorded it simply in the log. February 14th, no vessels sighted, wind high, temperature severe. The entry held no complaint, facts only. Mid-month brought a brief snowfall, dry and fine, carried sideways by persistent wind. The accumulation did not last. By afternoon, most had blown into the sea. But during the snowfall, as Elias watched from the lantern room, he felt a rare stillness settle within him. Not the heavy stillness of loneliness, not the urgent stillness before a storm, but a calm acceptance. The season had tested him. It had stripped away distractions. It had narrowed life to essentials, and he had remained. Toward the final week of February, subtle change whispered through the air. The cold remained sharp, but daylight lingered just slightly longer. Sunset delayed by minutes. It was enough to notice. Elias marked it unconsciously. He did not celebrate. He did not anticipate spring with impatience. He simply observed. Winter's deepest grip had passed. Not entirely, but the edge had softened. On the last night of the month, as Elias lit the lamp once more beneath a clear, star-filled sky, Elias stood watching the beam sweep outward across dark water. Back and forth, back and forth. February was the coldest watch, the most physically demanding, the most relentless. Yet the light had not faltered, and neither had he. Soon March would arrive. The sea would begin its slow transformation. The supply boat would return eventually. Voices would fill the tower again. But for now, in the fading edge of winter, Elias Turner remained steady at his post, guardian of flame, watcher of horizon, silent companion to wind and sea.
The first softening. March did not arrive with warmth. It arrived with light. The change was almost imperceptible at first. A few additional minutes of pale morning brightness, a slightly slower descent into evening shadow. Elias noticed it not with excitement, but with quiet awareness. The sun rose at a gentler angle now. The beam of the lighthouse, when extinguished at dawn, yielded to a horizon that felt less severe. The sky held hints of diluted gold rather than steel gray. The air remained cold, but it no longer carried the same biting edge that February had pressed into bone. On the first morning of March, Elias descended the spiral steps after extinguishing the lamp and paused midway down the tower. The silence felt different. Winter silence had weight. This silence held space. He could hear distant water movement in a softer rhythm, not calmer necessarily, but less sharp. The sea still wore winter's colors, slate blue and deep charcoal, yet along the edges near the rocks he noticed something subtle. The foam lingered longer before freezing. Ice formations that once clung stubbornly to the lower stones now melted by midday. These were small things, but in isolation, small things carried significance. Elias followed his routine as always. He polished the brass fittings in the lantern room, he inspected the lens panels for salt residue, he checked the oil reserves carefully. Still sufficient, though the next supply boat would be welcome. The fog bell had remained silent for weeks, the air too dry and clear for dense mist. But March is a transitional month, and Elias knew fog would return. He tested the mechanism anyway. A single pull. The bell's deep tone rolled outward over the water, carried on the mild breeze. It sounded less lonely than it had in autumn, perhaps because the world beyond the horizon was beginning to move again. On March 4th, a distant vessel appeared, small, far to the south, its smoke trail faint but steady. Elias adjusted the binoculars and watched without urgency. The ship did not alter course. It did not approach. It passed like a memory drifting along the edge of awareness. Still, its presence marked change. Trade routes were reopening, waters were clearing, human motion was returning to the larger world. That evening, as he lit the lamp, Elias felt a quiet acknowledgement within himself. He had endured the hardest stretch of winter alone. The coldest watches, the sharpest winds, the longest nights. The light had remained constant, and so had he. Mid-March brought the first rain, not snow, rain. It began softly during the early hours before dawn, tapping lightly against the lantern glass. Elias woke to the unfamiliar sound. Rain in winter had been rare and harsh, often freezing upon contact. This rain was steady and fluid. When he extinguished the lamp at sunrise, he stepped onto the balcony and let a few drops land on his gloved hand. They were cold, but not punishing. The rocks below darkened as the rain washed salt and debris into the sea. The air smelled different, cleaner, less metallic. He stood there longer than usual, watching the rain soften the hard edges of stone. The world seemed less rigid. Later that week, seabirds returned. Not in large flocks, just two at first. They circled the tower cautiously, their cries sharp but lively. Elias watched them from the lantern room. Their wings cut through the air with confident familiarity. They landed briefly on the outer railing, inspected the space, then departed toward the mainland cliffs. More would follow. They always did. The presence of birds altered the soundscape. The tower no longer held only wind and water. There were calls now, movement overhead, life asserting itself again. On March 12th, Elias found himself pausing during the afternoon to sit on the lower step outside the entrance. The sun rested higher than it had in months. Its warmth was faint but noticeable through layers of wool. He removed one glove, rested his bare hand against the stone wall. The surface still held winter's chill, yet beneath it he sensed retained heat. Stone absorbs slowly, releases slowly, just like memory, just like endurance. He did not think of home often, not in ways that brought ache, But on that afternoon, with birds overhead and light warming the rock, he allowed himself a brief recollection. A small kitchen window, steam rising from a kettle, the faint hum of distant street noise. Not longing, just remembrance. The present did not compete with the past. They coexisted quietly. By the third week of March, daylight extended noticeably. The lamp required lighting later each evening. Extinguishing came earlier. The watches shortened. Elias adjusted his schedule without thought. His body responded naturally to the shifting rhythm. Sleep came easier now. The wind, though still present, had lost its constant aggression. Storms remained possible, March was unpredictable, but the edge had softened. On March 21st, a thin layer of morning mist rolled in from the east. It was the first true fog since late autumn. Not thick, not consuming, just enough to blur the horizon and dull distant outlines. Elias prepared the fog bell mechanism and tested it again. When the mist deepened slightly near midday, he engaged the bell in steady intervals. Its resonant tone moved through the gray air like a patient heartbeat. He listened carefully between rings. Nothing approached, but procedure required vigilance. Fog carries both concealment and reflection. Sound travels differently within it. The bell's echo returned faintly from the water's surface, softer than before. By late afternoon, the mist dissolved under growing sunlight. The sea revealed itself once more. That evening, as he lit the lamp beneath a sky streaked with pale pink and fading blue, Elias felt the first true sense of seasonal turning. Not dramatic, not sudden, but undeniable. The harshest edge of isolation had passed with February's cold. March carried transition, movement, return. He did not greet it with excitement. He simply accepted it. The tower remained his responsibility. The flame remained his duty. But the world beyond the horizon was stirring, and with it, something within him stirred too. Not restlessness, not desire to leave, but awareness that time moves forward, even in solitude. The final days of March unfolded in quiet progression. More birds, longer light, gentler wind. On the evening of March 30th, Elias stood in the lantern room after lighting the lamp and watched the beams sweep outward across water that reflected faint traces of moonlight. Back and forth, back and forth. Winter demanded endurance. March asked only patience. April would bring something else. Not warmth yet, but growth. And with growth, perhaps new challenges. For now, Elias Turner remained steady, the loneliest lighthouse keeper in America, yet no longer surrounded solely by winter. The world, slowly and without fanfare, was waking.
The unexpected visitor. April arrived quietly. There was no dramatic shift in temperature, no sudden bloom of color along the rocky shoreline. The sea remained cool and restrained, and the wind still carried a trace of winter's memory. But the air felt lighter, not warmer, lighter. On the second morning of April, Elias extinguished the lamp beneath a sky washed in pale peach and silver. Dawn stretched longer now, unfolding slowly rather than arriving abruptly. He descended the spiral staircase with measured steps, listening to the familiar rhythm of his boots against iron. The tower felt settled, balanced. Winter had pressed against it for months, testing every seam and hinge. Now, in early spring, the structure seemed to exhale. Elias prepared a modest breakfast and reviewed the logbook.
Oil levels remained sufficient, though nearing the point where resupply would soon be necessary. Weather patterns had stabilized. No major storms had formed along the horizon in several days. He closed the book and paused. A faint sound drifted upward through the open lower doorway. Not wind, not water. Something irregular. He stood very still. The sound came again, a soft scraping against stone. Measured, hesitant. Elias moved toward the entrance and stepped outside onto the narrow platform carved into the rock. At first, he saw nothing unusual. The tide was receding slowly, revealing darkened stone slick with moisture. Gulls circled overhead, their presence now common in April. Then, near the base of the rocks below, he noticed movement. A small rowboat. Its paint weathered and faded. It drifted awkwardly in the shallow water, tethered loosely to a protruding stone. And beside it, seated carefully on a lower rock shelf, was a man. The figure wore a dark coat and wide-brimmed hat, both damp from sea spray. He appeared neither distressed nor hurried, simply present. Elias did not wave. He did not call out. Instead, he observed. The man below looked upward, having already noticed the lighthouse keeper's silhouette against the pale sky. For several seconds, they regarded one another in silence. Then, the man lifted a hand in a slow, deliberate gesture of greeting. Elias returned the gesture. No more. The tide continued its patient withdrawal, exposing a narrow path of uneven stone that could allow ascent to the tower's base. Elias waited. Visitors were rare. Unexpected arrivals rarer still. He considered protocol. The lighthouse was a federal post. Supplies were limited. Hospitality was secondary to duty. Yet isolation had taught him that caution need not exclude civility. After several minutes, the man below began his careful climb. Each step tested, each grip secure. He carried no visible weapon, only a small satchel slung across his shoulder. When he reached the base of the platform, he paused and removed his hat. "Good morning," the stranger said, voice calm and steady. "Morning," Elias replied. The man appeared older, perhaps in his late 50s. His face bore the softened lines of someone accustomed to outdoor work. His eyes held neither urgency nor fear. "I hope I'm not intruding. My name is Thomas Hale. My engine failed a mile east of here yesterday evening. I drifted through the night and found shelter along your rocks." Elias listened without interruption. "You're welcome to rest until the tide rises. From there you may row toward the mainland current." Thomas nodded gratefully. "I appreciate that." There was no dramatic exchange, no suspicion, just two men acknowledging circumstance. Elias gestured toward the narrow interior of the tower. "You may come inside briefly, it's warmer." Thomas stepped carefully across the threshold, removing his boots to avoid excessive salt and sand. Inside, the tower felt suddenly smaller. Not uncomfortable, just different. The presence of another human altered the air. Elias offered a simple cup of tea. They sat at the small wooden table near the base of the staircase. Conversation unfolded slowly. Thomas was a fisherman from a coastal town several miles north. Mechanical failure had left him adrift longer than intended. The lighthouse beam had guided him safely away from submerged rocks during the darkest hours. "I've seen your light for years," Thomas said quietly. "Never thought I'd stand inside its walls." Elias nodded once. "It does its work," he replied. Silence followed, but it was not strained. Thomas examined the interior respectfully. The narrow stairwell, the coiled ropes, the carefully maintained oil containers. "It must be quiet here," he observed. "It is," Elias answered. "Does it trouble you?" Elias considered the question. "Not often." Thomas accepted this without further inquiry. They spoke of simple things after that: shifting currents, seasonal fish migration, the early return of seabirds. No deep confessions, no probing into personal histories. Isolation, when shared briefly, does not require explanation. After an hour, the tide had risen enough to float the rowboat safely from its rocky cradle. Thomas stood and placed his hat back upon his head. "I won't forget your kindness," he said. "It was no burden," Elias replied. They stepped outside together. The sea had regained a gentle lift. Before descending the rocks, Thomas turned once more toward the tower. "That light," he said quietly, "means more than most people realize." Elias offered no grand response. He simply inclined his head. Thomas navigated carefully down the rocks, untethered his boat, and pushed away from shore. The oars dipped into water with steady rhythm. Within minutes, the small vessel became a diminishing shape against the widening sea. Elias remained standing on the platform long after the boat had disappeared beyond a low swell. The encounter had been brief, uneventful, yet something subtle lingered. The tower no longer felt entirely separate from the world. It never had been. Ships passed, birds nested, storms arrived. But direct human presence within its walls had been absent for many months. The echo of conversation seemed to rest lightly against the stone. Elias returned inside and climbed the spiral steps to the lantern room. Daylight filled the glass panes. The mechanism stood quiet, awaiting evening. He rested a hand against the brass railing. Solitude had shaped him through winter, but this small interruption had not disturbed his calm. It had simply reminded him that the light connected lives in ways he rarely witnessed. As afternoon stretched into evening, Elias prepared once more for nightfall. He trimmed the wick, he measured the oil, he polished the lens. When dusk settled, he struck the match. The flame rose. The beam began its steady sweep across open water. Back and forth, back and forth. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a fisherman rowed toward home, guided in part by that light. And within the tower, Elias Turner resumed his watch, no longer quite as isolated as he had been the day before. April had brought its first visitor. Not dramatic, not transformative, just a reminder. Even the loneliest lighthouse keeper stands at the center of unseen connections. The distant whistle. After Thomas Hale departed, the tower returned to its familiar quiet. But it was not the same quiet. It carried an aftertone now, like the faint resonance left in a bell after it has been struck. Elias resumed his routine without alteration. The lamp required trimming, the lens required polishing, the logbook required its steady entries of wind direction, tide level, and passing vessels. Yet beneath these small tasks, something had shifted. Human voices, even brief ones, have weight. They settle into memory like fine dust. April continued its slow unfolding. The days grew longer by noticeable increments. The sun rose earlier, casting thin golden lines across the lantern glass before Elias extinguished the flame. Evenings lingered in soft lavender and pale coral before surrendering to night. The sea had changed color as well. Winter's iron-gray tones had softened into deeper blues, occasionally streaked with green when sunlight pierced through passing clouds. Seabirds now circled regularly, some bold enough to land along the railing for extended rests. Their calls echoed against the stone, no longer sounding lonely, but purposeful. On April 10th, Elias noticed something else. Far beyond the southern horizon, barely visible through his binoculars, a thread of smoke. Not the drifting smoke of a small fishing vessel. This was thicker, straighter, more deliberate. He lowered the glasses and waited. The shape beneath the smoke gradually revealed itself, a steam-powered supply ship moving steadily northward along the established route. Not yet near enough to alter course toward the lighthouse, but its direction was clear. The quarterly supply vessel had departed port. It would not arrive immediately. Currents and weather would dictate its approach over several days. Still, the knowledge settled into Elias's awareness like a marked date on a calendar. Resupply meant fresh oil, new provisions, mail, perhaps a brief exchange of words. He did not smile at the thought. He did not grow restless, but he acknowledged it. Preparation began quietly. He inventoried remaining stores more carefully than usual. Flour was low, but sufficient. Salt pork nearly depleted. Tea reserves modest. The oil supply would last perhaps 2 weeks more at current usage. The timing was adequate. That evening, as he lit the lamp, the sky remained clear, and the beam carried far into open water. He imagined, though without certainty, that somewhere beyond sight, the supply ship's captain might already be noting the lighthouse's steady rhythm. Back and forth, back and forth. A signal not only to passing vessels, but to the scheduled return of connection. Over the next several days, the smoke reappeared intermittently along the horizon, sometimes visible at dawn, sometimes gone entirely. Weather shifted lightly. Mild rain one afternoon, followed by 2 days of clear skies. Elias prepared the lower landing for docking. He secured loose ropes, inspected the iron mooring ring embedded into stone, cleared debris that winter storms had wedged into crevices. The tasks were practical, but beneath them lay anticipation. On April 15th, just after midday, a faint sound reached him. He had been seated near the base of the tower, mending a worn section of rope. At first, he thought it wind pressing oddly against stone. Then it came again, long, low, a distinct whistle. Not the fog bell, not a seabird, a steam whistle carried across open water. Elias stood slowly and stepped outside. The horizon shimmered under mild sunlight, and there, emerging from behind a shallow curve of sea, the supply vessel advanced, its hull dark against bright water, its smokestack trailing steady gray into pale blue sky. The whistle sounded once more, a formal announcement of arrival. Elias raised a hand, though distance made the gesture symbolic rather than visible. The vessel adjusted its course gradually, reducing speed as it approached the rocky outcrop. Docking would not be simple. The lighthouse had no grand pier, only the reinforced landing carved into stone decades earlier. Timing with the tide was essential. Elias descended carefully to the lower rocks as the ship maneuvered into position offshore. A smaller rowboat was lowered by crew, 2 men inside, one at the oars, the other managing cargo ropes. The boat cut through water steadily, guided by practiced hands. When it reached the landing, Elias extended assistance without unnecessary speech. Crates were passed carefully, oil barrels secured, sacks of flour and preserved goods transferred with efficiency. The men worked with minimal conversation,
the rhythm of such exchanges long established. One of them, younger and broad-shouldered, offered a brief nod. "Light's been steady," he remarked. "It has," Elias replied. A small bundle was handed last, wrapped in waxed paper. Mail. Elias accepted it without visible reaction. The transfer concluded within an hour. The rowboat returned to the larger vessel, which remained anchored a short distance offshore. As the final whistle sounded, shorter this time, almost casual, the ship turned gradually southward. Its smoke thinned as distance widened. Within minutes, the only trace of its presence was a fading ripple upon the water. Elias carried the crates inside methodically. He stacked supplies in their proper places, replenished oil reserves in the storage alcove, recorded the delivery date in the logbook with neat, precise handwriting. April 15th, supplies received, conditions favorable. Only after all tasks were complete did he sit at the small wooden table and unwrap the bundle of mail. 2 letters, one official document from the Lighthouse service confirming his continued post through summer, and one handwritten envelope. He studied the script quietly before opening it. The contents were simple. A brief note from his sister in a distant inland town, news of his children, mention of early blossoms along riverbanks, a closing line expressing hope that the sea was treating him kindly. Elias read the letter twice, not with longing, but with stillness. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the small drawer beside his bunk. Evening approached as it always did. Despite the day's interruption, the light required tending. Elias climbed the spiral staircase once more. He trimmed the wick, adjusted the lens, struck the match. The flame rose obediently. The beam began its steady sweep across darkening water, back and forth, back and forth. Tonight, the light carried freshly delivered oil. The tower held replenished provisions, and within its quiet walls rested the faint echo of human presence, both recent and distant. Spring had arrived not with spectacle, but with continuity. The world beyond the horizon remained vast, but the connection to it felt tangible, measured not in crowds or noise, but in whistles across water, in crates passed by steady hands, in letters folded carefully into drawers. Elias Turner resumed his watch, no less solitary, but reminded once again that even solitude exists within a larger current.
The longer evenings. Late April leaned gently toward May. The shift was not dramatic. The sea did not suddenly sparkle, nor did warmth flood the stones in a single rush. Instead, the change arrived in increments so small they could only be noticed by someone who watched the horizon every day. Elias noticed. The evenings were the first to lengthen noticeably. After extinguishing the lamp at dawn, he no longer returned immediately to sleep. The light filtering through the narrow windows of the tower carried a soft gold that felt patient rather than urgent. And at night, when he lit the flame, darkness waited longer before fully settling. The beams still swept faithfully, back and forth, back and forth. But twilight lingered beneath it now, a gentle blue wash that softened the sharp contrast between light and sea. With fresh supplies secured and oil reserves replenished, Elias found his movements unhurried. There was no immediate scarcity pressing against his thoughts. The winter's strict accounting had eased. He maintained his routines with steady precision. Lens polished every third day, wick trimmed nightly, brass fittings cleaned until they held faint reflections of lantern light. Yet between these tasks, moments opened. On one such afternoon, Elias carried a small wooden stool outside and positioned it along the sheltered side of the tower where wind rarely reached directly. He sat facing west, watching the low swell of water rise and fall against rock. The tide moved differently in spring, less violent, more rhythmic. He listened to it as one might listen to distant breathing. Seabirds had grown bold. A pair of gulls had chosen a narrow ledge along the northern face of the rock as nesting ground. Their presence was constant now. Soft rustling, occasional sharp cries, wings brushing air. At first, Elias had considered their proximity a minor disturbance. Now he accepted it as seasonal company. Life returns where it can. One evening near the end of April, the sky performed a quiet display. Clouds stretched thin across the horizon, catching the setting sun in muted shades of rose and amber. The water reflected these colors imperfectly, as though unsure how long to hold them. Elias stood in the lantern room before lighting the lamp, watching the sky deepen. He did not rush. There was time. He struck the match only when true darkness began to gather at the edges of sea and sky. The flame caught, and the familiar glow filled the lens chamber. He adjusted the mechanism gently. The beam resumed its slow arc, back and forth, back and forth. But something inside him felt less mechanical now. Winter had shaped him into endurance. Spring was shaping him into awareness. He found himself observing details he had previously overlooked, the subtle differences in wave patterns between morning and evening, the way sunlight touched the upper railing first before sliding downward, the faint hum within the tower when wind struck from a particular angle. None of these things altered his duty. They simply filled it. In early May, a mild storm passed through, more rain than wind. The drops struck the lantern glass in steady rhythm, blurring the world beyond into silver streaks. Elias remained awake longer than necessary that night, listening to the rain's cadence. It did not demand vigilance the way winter storms had. It requested only attention. In the morning, the rocks below gleamed clean, stripped of salt crust and dried kelp. The air smelled briefly of earth, a rare scent so far from soil. Later that week, Elias discovered something small but unexpected. Near the base of the tower, in a shallow crevice protected from heavy wind, a thin patch of green had emerged. At first, he thought it seaweed caught by tide. But upon closer inspection, he realized it was grass, sparse, fragile, but alive. Carried perhaps by seabird or storm long ago, the seed had found purchase in a pocket of accumulated grit and moisture. Through winter, it had remained hidden. Now, under lengthening sun, it rose. Elias crouched beside it for several minutes. He did not touch it. He simply observed. Growth in unlikely places was not dramatic. It was patient, like light across water, like stone shaped by years of tide. The discovery lingered with him long after he returned inside. Something within him mirrored that small patch of green. Not a desire to leave, not dissatisfaction, but a subtle expansion. Isolation once felt like a narrowing corridor. Now it felt like a wide plain with gentle movement at its edges. The letter from his sister remained folded in the drawer beside his bunk. He reread it one evening before sleep, tracing the careful loops of her handwriting. Children growing, riverbanks blooming, life unfolding inland. He did not compare those scenes to his own. He simply acknowledged that both existed. The lighthouse beam swept the ocean. The river moved quietly through fields, different forms of continuity. Mid-May approached with steady warmth during daylight hours. Elias removed one layer of wool while working outdoors. His movements felt lighter, less encumbered. He repaired a section of railing loosened by winter storms, replaced worn rope along the landing, cleared debris from the nesting ledge without disturbing its occupants. Evenings now arrived gently. Sunset lingered long enough that the lamp felt less like a guardian against darkness and more like a companion to fading light. On May 18th, after lighting the flame, Elias remained standing beside the lens for an extended time. The sky still held a trace of deep blue, and the first stars appeared cautiously above. The beam cut across water that shimmered faintly with reflected twilight. Back and forth, back and forth. He placed his hand against the brass housing and felt the steady warmth of the lamp. Winter required survival. Spring required presence. He was still alone. The tower remained solitary upon its rock. Ships passed occasionally at safe distance. Birds nested and departed. The supply vessel would not return for months. Yet the loneliness that once felt heavy had thinned, not because the world had grown louder, but because he had grown accustomed to its quiet. The longer evenings carried a different kind of watch, less burdened, more reflective. Elias Turner stood within the lantern room as night finally deepened around him. The light continued its patient arc across open water, and within that rhythm he felt something steady unfolding, not change that demanded action, but change that invited understanding. Spring was no longer approaching. It had arrived. The question of staying. By late May, the air had changed completely. It was no longer sharp when Elias stepped outside at dawn. It carried a softness that settled against skin rather than pressing through it. The sea, too, seemed broader somehow, not in size, but in temperament. Waves rolled in longer patterns now, stretched and unhurried. The lighthouse stood exactly as it always had. Stone, iron, glass, flame. Yet the world around it had shifted into early summer's quiet expansion. Elias noticed that he was sleeping more deeply. The wind no longer clawed at the tower through the night. Rain came and went without violence. Even the fog, which returned in pale drifting sheets some mornings, felt gentle. When mist wrapped the tower, Elias would engage the fog bell in steady intervals. Its low tone carried outward across the unseen water. A pause, then again. A pause, then again. The rhythm felt less like warning and more like reassurance. In these lengthening days, a thought began forming, not abrupt, not intrusive, but steady. It came first as curiosity. How long would he remain here? His official appointment extended through summer. The letter from the Lighthouse service had been clear. Renewal could be requested. Transfers were possible. He had never considered requesting one. The post had been given. He had accepted. That was the beginning and end of it. But now, with winter endured and spring unfolding, the question lingered quietly in the back of his mind. Not because he was unhappy, not because he felt trapped, simply because time was moving. And time, when noticed closely, asks things of a person. One afternoon in early June, Elias carried his stool once more to the sheltered western side of the tower. The gull chicks had hatched days earlier. Small gray shapes now shifted awkwardly along the ledge, their movements uncertain but determined. The parent birds moved constantly, outward to sea, then back again with food. Life layered itself upon the rock without ceremony. Elias watched this pattern for a long while. Care, return, growth, departure. It was a cycle he had observed before in other seasons, but watching it now, something in it resonated differently. He rose and walked slowly down to the narrow landing where supply boats docked. The iron ring embedded in stone caught sunlight, warm beneath his palm. Beyond it, the open water extended without boundary. He tried to imagine leaving. The mainland held towns and markets, narrow streets and conversation. It held voices that overlapped and blended, footsteps that echoed against wooden floors. He remembered those things clearly, but they felt distant, not in memory, but in sensation. The tower had simplified his world. Each day held defined tasks. Each night carried the same responsibility. Back and forth, back and forth. The beam did not question its arc. It simply moved. That evening, as twilight stretched wide across the sea, Elias delayed lighting the lamp by a minute longer than usual, not out of neglect, but observation. The horizon glowed with a depth of orange that seemed to pulse gently before fading. The first star appeared. He struck the match. The flame rose. The lens caught it. The beam began its patient sweep. Standing there, Elias felt the question settle more clearly. Was he here because he had nowhere else to go, or because he had chosen to stay? The difference was subtle, but important. In winter, the question would not have arisen. Survival occupies all thought during cold months. Now, with warmth returning and birds raising their young, space had opened within his mind. He did not rush toward an answer. He allowed the question to exist. Days passed. The sea remained steady. Occasional fishing boats moved along the distant line where water met sky. Once, a larger steamship crossed far to the south, its smoke trailing thin and gray. Elias marked each vessel in the logbook with quiet precision. On June 12th, he received an unexpected sign of life from shore. A small sailboat approached cautiously in afternoon light, keeping respectful distance from the rocks. A lone sailor raised his arm in greeting. Elias returned the gesture. No docking was attempted. The boat merely circled once within visible range, perhaps drawn by curiosity, perhaps simply charting the coastline, and then drifted onward. The exchange lasted less than 5 minutes, yet it reminded Elias of something simple. The lighthouse was not separate from the world. It was part of its movement, part of its navigation, a fixed point in a shifting landscape. That night, Elias remained awake longer than required, seated beside the mechanism that turned the lens. He listened to the soft, steady click of gears. He placed his hand lightly against the warm brass housing. The question returned. Staying is not the same as being left behind. Staying can be a choice, and choice carries quiet power. Early summer deepened. The small patch of grass at the base of the tower had grown taller, bending slightly under sea breeze. It would never become a meadow. It would never spread far. But it persisted. Elias found himself checking it each morning without conscious decision. Life in unlikely places. Maybe that was what the tower itself represented. A structure rooted in rock, holding flame against vastness. Toward the end of June, the days grew long enough that full darkness came late. The lamp burned fewer hours, yet its purpose remained unchanged. One evening, as Elias stood in the lantern room watching the beam sweep across water tinted deep indigo, he spoke softly into the empty space. "I will stay." The words were not dramatic. They were not defiant. They were simply clear. He would remain through summer, not because he must, but because he chose to. The decision settled gently within him, like stone finding balance after years of tide. The beam continued its motion, back and forth, back and forth. Below, the sea breathed in slow, endless rhythm. Above, the sky opened wide and star-filled. Elias Turner, once shaped by winter solitude, now stood in early summer light with quiet certainty. The loneliest lighthouse keeper in America, and yet no longer questioning the stillness around him. He had chosen it. The still water. By early July, the sea had grown calm in a way Elias had almost forgotten was possible. Not calm in passing moments between storms, not calm in the brief hush before dawn, but sustained calm. Days passed when the water lay stretched like darkened glass, interrupted only by slow, rolling swells that barely touched the rocks below the tower. The wind, once a constant companion, had softened into something intermittent and warm. At night, when Elias lit the lamp, the beam traveled across a surface so smooth it seemed to slide rather than cut. Back and forth, back and forth. The gull chicks had grown larger. Their down had given way to stronger feathers, and they tested their wings along the ledges with awkward determination. The small patch of grass at the tower's base now bent fully in the breeze, thin blades glinting faintly under sunlight. Life persisted quietly. And yet, within this extended calm, a different kind of test began to form. It started with restlessness, not sharp, not uncomfortable, but noticeable. When wind howls and waves crash, attention sharpens naturally. The body responds to urgency without invitation. Every sound matters. But when water lies still and air holds steady warmth, vigilance becomes subtler. On the fourth consecutive day of near-perfect calm, Elias found himself pausing longer between tasks. He polished the lens, but without the same measured intensity winter had required. He checked the oil levels, though they were more than sufficient. He reviewed the logbook, noting minimal vessel activity. Summer trade had shifted further offshore this season. There was less to record, less to repair, less to brace against. The tower no longer demanded endurance. It required consistency. Consistency can be quieter than hardship, and sometimes more difficult. One afternoon, Elias descended to the lower landing and stood looking out over the wide, unbroken horizon. The sea reflected the sky so completely that the boundary between them blurred. It would have been easy, dangerously easy, to believe that nothing could go wrong on such a day. But Elias knew better. Calm water conceals currents. Clear skies invite complacency. He had been trained for vigilance, not reaction. That evening, as twilight settled, he delayed lighting the lamp only until necessary, as always. Yet as he struck the match, he felt a subtle shift inside himself. The question was no longer whether he would stay. He had answered that. The new question was quieter. How does one remain attentive when nothing demands attention? The beam began its steady sweep, back and forth, back and forth. The water mirrored its light almost perfectly, doubling the arc in reflection. The sight was beautiful, but beauty can lull. On July 9th, the air grew heavier. Not storm-heavy. Humidity gathered without clouds. The horizon shimmered faintly under the midday sun. Elias sensed change long before it became visible. The birds fell quiet. Even the young gulls remained settled along their ledge. Stillness deepened. He climbed to the lantern room and scanned the horizon carefully with binoculars. Far to the west, barely perceptible, a thin line disturbed the surface of the sea. Not a wave, not a vessel, a subtle ripple stretching unnaturally straight. A current shift. Calm water often disguises powerful undercurrents, especially during seasonal transitions. Boats that drift lazily across the surface can be caught unexpectedly. By late afternoon, a small sailboat appeared, closer than most summer vessels dared approach. Its sail hung slack in the nearly windless air. The boat moved slowly, almost imperceptibly toward the rocky perimeter of the lighthouse's outcrop. At first, Elias assumed the captain would adjust course, but minutes passed and the vessel's angle did not change. The current was stronger than the sailor realized. Elias descended swiftly to the fog bell mechanism. Though no fog obscured visibility, the bell's deep tone could serve as warning. He engaged it. The first resonant strike rolled outward across the glassy sea. A pause, then again. The sound carried farther than usual in the heavy air. On the sailboat, a figure stirred. The sail adjusted slightly, but the boat continued its slow drift. Elias rang the bell again, longer this time, deliberate. The sailor finally appeared fully alert, moving quickly to lower part of the sail and adjust the rudder. But the current pulled stubbornly. Calm water does not reveal its strength until resistance meets it. Elias moved back up to the lantern room and ignited the lamp early, though dusk had not yet fully arrived. The sudden appearance of the bright beam across otherwise sunlit water was unusual, unmistakable. The rotating arc crossed directly in the sailboat's path. Back and forth, back and forth. The water mirrored its light almost perfectly, doubling the arc in reflection. The sight was beautiful, but beauty can lull. When full evening arrived, Elias allowed the lamp to continue its natural rhythm. The fog bell fell silent. The sea, as if unaware of the tension it had carried, returned to its mirrored calm. Later that night, seated beside the mechanism, Elias understood the test summer had brought. Not storm, not cold, but subtlety. To remain attentive when danger whispers rather than roars. To act without panic when calm deceives. Consistency is not passive. It is a choice repeated quietly. The beams swept outward across the tranquil water. Back and forth. Back and forth. The lighthouse had fulfilled its purpose once more, not against fury, but against illusion. And Elias Turner, steady in early summer's stillness, felt his resolve deepen. The sea would always change, sometimes violently, sometimes invisibly. His task remained the same: to watch, to listen, to light the flame, even when nothing appears to require it. The Child Who Saw the Light. August arrived without announcement. The air carried warmth during the day, but mornings had begun to feel slightly cooler. It was the kind of change only someone living closely with the weather would notice, a faint whisper of the coming autumn hidden inside late summer sunlight. Elias noticed it during his early walk around the base of the tower. The small patch of grass still swayed in the breeze. The yellow flowers remained, though a few petals had begun to fall away. Seasons rarely changed all at once. They faded into one another. That morning, the sea was calm again, though not as perfectly still as in early July. Gentle ripples crossed the surface, reflecting sunlight in shifting patterns. Elias completed his routine as usual. Logbook updated, lens cleaned, oil measured. The day stretched ahead quietly. Around midday, however, he heard something unexpected. A distant sound, light and irregular. Not the steady engine of a steam vessel, not the creak of oars. It sounded like laughter. Elias stepped outside and scanned the horizon. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then, gradually, a small sailboat appeared from behind a low swell. It was larger than the fishing boats that occasionally passed nearby, but smaller than the supply vessels. The sail caught the wind gently, guiding the boat along a careful path several hundred yards from the lighthouse rocks. Through his binoculars, Elias could see 3 figures aboard, 2 adults and 1 child. The boat slowed slightly as it approached the lighthouse's visible range. The adults appeared relaxed, speaking casually as they adjusted the sail, but the child stood near the bow, gripping the railing and staring toward the tower. Children often notice things adults pass by without thought. The boat drifted in a slow arc, keeping a respectful distance from the rocks. Elias raised an arm suddenly, waving with enthusiastic energy. Elias hesitated only a moment before raising his own hand in reply. From this distance, the gesture would appear small, but the child responded immediately, jumping slightly with excitement. Elias lowered the binoculars. He remained standing on the platform, watching quietly as the boat circled once around the safe outer perimeter. The adults seemed to explain something to the child, pointing toward the lantern room high above. Perhaps they were describing how the light worked, or why it existed at all. The child continued looking upward. It was not curiosity alone. There was wonder there, a kind of attention Elias had not considered in many months. He had always thought of the lighthouse beam as a tool, something practical, something necessary for navigation and safety. But to someone seeing it for the first time, it might appear as something else entirely. A signal in the darkness, a silent guardian standing far from shore. Eventually, the boat began drifting away again, carried slowly by wind and tide. Before it passed beyond sight, the child waved one more time. Elias returned the gesture. Then the boat disappeared along the eastern horizon. The encounter lasted less than 10 minutes, yet its effect lingered. That evening, as dusk settled slowly across the sea, Elias prepared the lamp as always. He trimmed the wick carefully, adjusted the lens, measured the oil. When the sky darkened enough, he struck the match. The flame rose gently, catching within the glass enclosure. The lens captured it. The beam began its patient sweep, back and forth, back and forth. But tonight, Elias imagined something new. Somewhere along the coastline, perhaps miles away, that child might be watching the horizon after sunset, waiting to see the lighthouse beam appear, waiting to confirm that the light truly existed, not just as a story told on a passing boat, but as something real. The thought reshaped Elias's understanding in a quiet but profound way. For ships, the lighthouse meant safety. For sailors, it meant navigation. But for someone seeing it with new eyes, it meant possibility. a single steady light in a vast dark sea. Late that night, Elias remained seated beside the lantern longer than usual. The beam continued its endless motion, back and forth, back and forth. He imagined the countless people who had seen that light over the years, fishermen, travelers, sailors crossing unfamiliar waters, and perhaps, occasionally, a child who would remember it long after the journey ended. The lighthouse was not simply a marker on a map, it was a memory waiting to happen. And Elias Turner, standing quietly within its walls, was part of that memory. Not seen, not known, but present. August nights deepened slowly. The stars seemed brighter now, scattered across the sky like distant lanterns of their own. The sea carried the beam outward into darkness, where unseen travelers might glimpse it. A steady rhythm, a patient signal, a quiet promise. Elias understood now that his role was larger than the tower itself. He was not simply maintaining a machine, he was keeping alive a moment of certainty in an uncertain world. For ships, for sailors, and perhaps for a child watching the horizon with wide and curious eyes. The beam moved again across the water, back and forth, and somewhere beyond the darkness, someone might be seeing it for the first time. When the light becomes a life. September approached quietly. Summer did not leave all at once. The days were still warm, and sunlight continued to stretch comfortably across the sea during the afternoon hours. But subtle changes had begun to appear, the kind that only someone living close to nature would notice. The mornings were cooler. The wind carried a slightly sharper edge, and the sunsets lingered a little less each evening. Elias Turner recognized these signs instinctively. He had watched seasons shift across this horizon long enough to read them the way a sailor reads currents. Autumn was beginning its slow arrival. The lighthouse itself remained unchanged. Stone walls stood firm against salt and wind. The lantern glass gleamed from careful polishing. The brass housing of the lamp held its quiet warmth each night when the flame was lit. But inside Elias, something had settled into a deeper understanding. The visit from the small sailboat weeks earlier, the child waving toward the tower, had left a lasting impression. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady. Before that moment, Elias had thought of his work mainly in practical terms. Ships required guidance. Rocks required warning. The lamp served a purpose. But now he realized something else had been happening all along. The light had become part of people's lives. Some sailors might glance at it briefly while adjusting their course. Some travelers might notice it from a distant shoreline while walking along the beach. And occasionally, someone might remember it for years. A single steady beam sweeping across dark water. Back and forth. Back and forth. The familiar motion filled the lantern room with its quiet rhythm. Elias rested his hand against the warm brass housing and watched the ark move across the sea. Something about the moment felt different, not because anything had changed, but because he understood it differently now. This lighthouse had been standing long before he arrived, and one day, Long after he left, someone else would climb these same stairs. Someone else would trim the wick. Someone else would light the flame. The light did not belong to him, but the care he gave it did. Each night he kept it burning, he became part of its long story. A story stretching across decades of storms, ships, travelers, and unseen watchers. The beam moved across the horizon again, back and forth, back and forth. Elias imagined the child from the sailboat, perhaps back at home now, asking questions about the lighthouse they had seen, perhaps remembering the moment the keeper had waved back. It was a small moment, but small moments often remain the longest. Later that night, Elias stepped outside onto the narrow balcony. The sea was dark now, reflecting scattered stars above. The lighthouse beam passed over the water, briefly illuminating distant ripples before continuing its arc. Somewhere out there, a ship would see that light and adjust its course. Perhaps no one aboard would think about the person tending the lamp. Perhaps they would simply trust the signal and continue on their journey. That was enough. The lighthouse was never meant to be noticed for long. It existed to guide, to warn, to reassure. And Elias had become part of that quiet promise. He stood there for several minutes, listening to the steady breathing of the sea below. The wind moved gently across the rocks. Far above, the stars seemed endless. Inside the lantern room, the light continued its patient work. Back and forth, back and forth. Elias Turner, once the loneliest lighthouse in America, now understood something simple but profound. Loneliness fades when purpose grows clear, and the purpose of the lighthouse had become the purpose of his life. Not forever, but for as long as the flame burned under his watch. The night stretched wide across the ocean, and the light continued to move. Steady, patient, endless. The light that remains. October arrived slowly, like a tide that rises so gently it is almost unnoticed. The first clear sign came with the wind. It returned not as a storm, but as a familiar presence brushing against the stone walls of the lighthouse. The air carried a crispness that had been absent during summer's long, warm days. Elias noticed it one morning as he stepped outside after extinguishing the lamp. The horizon was pale and quiet. Thin clouds stretched across the sky, catching the earliest hint of sunlight. The sea below moved in longer, cooler swells. Autumn had begun its quiet work. Inside the tower, everything remained steady. The lantern glass shone from careful polishing. The brass housing held its familiar dull glow. The spiral staircase wound upward through the center of the lighthouse exactly as it always had. And Elias moved through his routines with the same calm rhythm he had carried for many months. Morning inspection, logbook entries, oil measurements, small repairs where needed. The days no longer felt long, they simply unfolded. Sometimes a distant ship crossed the southern horizon. Sometimes seabirds paused briefly along the railing before continuing their migrations. Sometimes the sea stretched empty from one end of the horizon to the other. But every evening, without exception, Elias climbed the staircase as dusk settled over the water. He prepared the lamp, trimmed the wick, checked the oil, and lit the flame. The beam would emerge slowly at first. Then, once the mechanism turned, it began its steady arc, back and forth, back and forth. The same motion that had guided sailors for years, the same motion that would continue long after he was gone. One quiet afternoon in mid-October, Elias sat on the stool outside the western side of the tower. The small patch of grass at the base of the rock had turned slightly golden now. The tiny flowers were gone, but their thin stems still moved gently in the breeze. He studied them for a while. Then he lifted his eyes toward the open sea. The horizon stretched endlessly. Watching it had once made him feel small. Now it simply made him feel calm. Time had changed the meaning of solitude. Months earlier, the silence of the lighthouse had seemed heavy at times, like a weight pressing against the edges of his thoughts. But slowly, through winter storms and spring mornings, through summer calm and drifting memories, the silence had transformed. It had become space. Space to observe, space to breathe, space to understand things that are easily missed in louder places. That evening, the sunset was particularly gentle. Soft shades of amber and pale red spread across the clouds as the sun slipped toward the horizon. Elias stood inside the lantern room watching the final light of day fade over the water. Soon it would be time to light the lamp again. He struck the match. The flame appeared with a small, steady glow. He adjusted the wick carefully, allowing the light to strengthen. The great lens captured the flame and carried it outward into the growing darkness. Back and forth, back and forth. Standing there beside the warm brass housing, Elias felt no urgency, no loneliness, no question about whether he belonged here. The lighthouse had become part of him in the quiet way that daily work shapes a person over time. Each night he kept the light burning, he added another small moment to its long history. A history not written in books, but in safe passages across dark waters. A history carried silently by sailors who might never know his name. Later that night, Elias stepped onto the narrow balcony outside the lantern room. The wind had strengthened slightly, carrying the smell of salt and distant rain. Far below, waves moved steadily against the rocks. Above him, the sky opened wide with stars, and the beam continued its patient motion across the sea. Back and forth, back and forth. Elias rested his hands on the cool iron railing. Somewhere far beyond the horizon, ships were moving through the darkness. Perhaps a captain would see the light sweep across the water and adjust his course slightly. Perhaps a fisherman returning home would feel reassured as he glanced toward the tower. Perhaps a child standing on a distant shore would notice the beam for the very first time and wonder who kept it shining. Elias did not need to know. The light itself carried the answer. He remained there for several minutes, listening to the wind and watching the beam travel outward into the night. Eventually, he returned inside, closing the door softly behind him. The lantern room glowed with warm, steady light. The mechanism continued turning without pause, back and forth, back and forth. And somewhere beyond the darkness, unseen travelers moved safely across the water. The lighthouse stood exactly where it had always stood, a quiet guardian of the sea. And within its walls, Elias Turner, once called the loneliest lighthouse keeper in America, had discovered something simple and enduring. Solitude is not emptiness. Sometimes it is simply a place where a single light can shine clearly. The beam swept outward again across the endless ocean, steady, patient, endless. And through the long night, the light remained.